Hello, everyone. Many of you have been waiting for some time now to hear the story of how the Lord has brought the two of us together.
Well, at this time, we'd like to share with you the goodness of our Lord in working so distinctly and in such a unique way in our lives.
We hope that you enjoy the story and that it's a blessing to you today.
Though our story truly starts back in Alyssa's and my high school years when we made a decision to wait for God's choice of a life mate, we will begin telling our story from the point of when our lives finally began to intertwine. After my graduation from the Lehigh Valley Baptist Bible Institute in the spring of 2011, I began to spend more time praying with my parents that God would bring the right girl into my life to be my wife. The Lord began to impress more so on me that the time was coming for me to focus my attention on this area of life. The Lord brought my attention to Alyssa, and I began to follow her blog to learn more about her. She had already been following my sister's blog for a few months. I decided not to mention it to my parents yet. I didn't want to bring it up until I felt that this was even a direction worth considering.
While Ben was actively praying for a wife who would complement the Lord's call in his life to go into the ministry, I was preparing to spend 3 months in Thailand with the Good A's. It was during this time that the Lord really began to burden my heart for missions and opened my heart to the possibility of a future in missions. After returning from my trip in Thailand, I continued in my studies that fall in music at the local Skagit Valley College, not having any idea that the Lord was already working to bring a man into my life.
On my birthday in November, I told my parents about Alyssa, which initially perked my mom's excitement, until she realized how far away Washington State was. This would truly be an obstacle because how could my parents and I really learn about her when she was so far away? It was during this time that our prayers together began to shift from a more general time of praying together for a wife into praying specifically how we could get to know Alyssa. I knew for myself I didn't just want to simply pick a girl based on how she looked, the abilities she had, and the character she seemed to possess, but whether the Lord was the one directing the whole situation. I wanted God's wisdom and confidence in this very important decision.
I had heard about Benjamin several years ago from some friends, and from what I had seen on his blog, he seemed to be a nice guy, but I just dismissed the whole thing and put my future in the Lord's hands and just moved on with school. Later, I saw the Who We Are video that Lehigh Valley Baptist Church had produced, and I realized that Benjamin was the main person behind the whole project. I was very impressed with his abilities and the initiative it must have taken to put together such an involved video. It was a small piece in the puzzle I was beginning to form in my mind of Benjamin.
I continued to read up on Alyssa's blog and restrained myself from conniving out a way to get over to Washington. I obviously wanted to meet her in person, but overall I wanted to see God's hand directing me to her. My parents and I continued to pray often, and in January, I found out Pastor Roland was going to be flying out to Washington to preach a series of messages. Somehow, I didn't put two and two together in my mind that where Pastor Roland was going was actually where Alyssa lived.
Pastor Roland came to town to preach, and I thought it was pretty interesting that he already knew my name. Little did I know that he had me in mind for Benjamin, and had already talked to Pastor Sargent about the possibility.
One night, I went to my sister's room and began talking with Nina and Selena about going over to Washington to meet Alyssa. My mind had been formulating some clever ways to make it seem natural why I would show up at the church. We started discussing the different scenarios, but after each one was brought up, we ended up shooting it down. At the conclusion, we decided that if we really wanted to see God at work, then I would need to stop thinking that I could control everything and rather just continue what I had been doing, praying that God would allow me to meet her. It was then that I decided that I would specifically pray that God would allow me to work on a video project, because I wanted to see God answer a specific prayer if it was His will for me to go and see her.
During this time, I continued to stay busy studying music at college, teaching piano, and printing books in the publications ministry at my church. I had a very strong desire to be married, but the Lord gave me plenty to do while I was waiting for Him to bring someone into my life.
I really had no idea when it would happen, but I knew that the Lord was growing me in ways and preparing me for when that time would come.
The night that I had that conversation with my sisters, Pastor Roland had already been back from Washington for 2 days. That night I prayed in my room specifically, letting God know that I was content with whatever his time frame was for me to get married, and that I really wanted to know more about Alyssa. I prayed that if it was okay with the Lord, I would love to get a video project at Pastor Sargent's church so that I could stay up there for some time to know in my own mind whether she was the right person for me or not. The next morning, Pastor Roland came to my office and asked me to run some errands with him. I went with him, and while we were driving, he asked me whether I would like to stay for a month in Washington because the church could use some video help. He did not mention anything about Alyssa at the time. You can only imagine my excitement. A month was beyond what I expected to get to be there.
I had heard that Benjamin was coming through various sources, and I tried to keep a right perspective and not be hopeful for anything to happen. After all, I had heard about him and was super excited to meet him. I purposed in my mind that I would only think about a friendship with him and keep my actions lined up that way.
I didn't know how this trip would turn out. I could, after all this excitement and prayer, be simply left with the answer to wait more. I certainly hoped that it would not be the case, but I was determined that I would only go forward if the Lord made that clear to me. And if I was to wait, I would. My perspective was that I had waited a long time for a girl who was the choice God had for me, and the last thing I wanted to do was throw away all of those years of waiting just to make a rash decision because I was feeling impatient.
As May approached, I became more and more excited to meet Benjamin. I had always wanted to visit Lehigh Valley Baptist Church, and I had some friends there, so it was really exciting to meet someone from that church. Yes, I had my suspicions, but I continued to keep my focus on track.
I read Alyssa's blog even more excitedly for the next few months before I left. And one funny story about that time was one day before I left for piano lessons, I decided that I would try to see some other pictures of Alyssa on her Facebook page. Since I didn't want to get Alyssa's thoughts up as to why I would be coming, I didn't want to add her as a friend on Facebook. However, I found out that I couldn't see her pictures because I wasn't her friend. And while I was trying to tap on her profile on my iPhone, the Facebook app froze. And so I tapped a couple more times trying to get it to go. And then when it unfroze, I saw the option to unfriend her. And I thought, why would I unfriend her if I wasn't even her friend? Then I realized what had just happened. I'd invited her to be my friend. My sisters had a couple funny comments to kid with me about after that experience. Needless to say, I did get to see her pictures. And I never unfriended her.
May was getting closer, and I knew the day that Benjamin would be arriving. I was getting more and more excited to meet him. Our first meeting was an experience. I was at the church, busily working on a project to prepare for the ordination of one of our pastors, and I had several people helping me. I knew that Benjamin was probably at the church and was preparing myself for the first meeting. Sure enough, he walked in and jumped right in on the project. If I had to describe that first meeting in one word, it would be observing. We observed actions, words, and characteristics. I remained distant for fear of coming across as forward. I may have been a little too careful with that.
My experience on that day was that after I arrived, Pastor Sargent had a staff meeting, and during that staff meeting, I found out that I wasn't going to be meeting with the Howards till later in the following week. I was a little disappointed inside by that because I was hoping to meet them right away so that I could get an idea of how things would go. But I knew I'd got there only by the Lord's working, so I didn't want to start controlling things now that I was there. After we came out for a break from one of our meetings, Mrs. Vaughn told me that plans were changed, and I would be eating with the Howards that night. I knew Pastor Sargent had his fingers in that change, and as Alyssa mentioned, I did meet her before supper that night. When I first met Alyssa, I was being given a tour around the building by Pastor Geist. But then after that was over, I went over to help out with the books.
That night, Benjamin came over for dinner, and from there, we hit it off great. We spent a long time in conversation, and I could see immediately that he got along well with my family. Bonus points right there. It was pretty amazing how the Lord worked the timing out, because my dad was scheduled to leave for deployment as soon as Ben got into town, but it was delayed a couple of weeks, which allowed him and Benjamin to spend some time with each other. The observing continued, but after that night, I knew that if nothing else, we would become great friends.
Over the next week, Alyssa and I spent a lot of time together doing various group activities. Dinner at the Howard's house became quite frequent as I got to know Alyssa and her family better. The Lord worked out as only He could for me to go on a trip to visit the McDowells and Majors. It was a perfect time for me to think on the lengthy conversation I had with Pastor and Mrs. Sargent the previous night, and text back and forth with my parents and discuss the idea of moving forward. At that point, I felt that if I did not move forward, I would be going against what the Lord had been clearly showing me in His Word in recent months, and the signs that He had been putting in front of me. I knew I had to make a decision quickly because Alyssa's dad was about to be deployed again.
While Benjamin left to go to Eastern Washington with the McDowells for a week, I left to go on a school choir trip. At this point, we both knew, and our families, which direction the Lord was leading us, and we desired to take it to the next step of more serious conversation. Even though I knew that for myself, I was not expecting the phone call that came on my birthday. Ben's dad called my dad requesting for me to come out to Pennsylvania for a visit the next month so that they could get to know me. I think my answer came out rather excitedly, and we began to make some plans.
For the rest of the time that I spent in Washington, I spent almost every evening at the Howard's house as Alyssa and I began our journey together. Our friendship quickly deepened as we saw the Lord work between us. A few weeks later, I was back in Pennsylvania, and a month later, Alyssa arrived to meet my family.
My visit to Pennsylvania was brief but life-changing. I knew at this point that I loved Benjamin and that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. Little did I know how much more I would grow to love him over the next year. I spent my summer very busy in ministry between going to camp as a counselor and spending a month in Mexico on a missions trip. Upon my return, I busily prepared to return to school and secretly hoped that Benjamin would come for a visit. I was just about to give up hope when suddenly I had the surprise of my life. Benjamin on one knee asking me to marry him.
After talking back and forth with Alyssa's dad overseas in Bahrain via Skype, email, and Facebook messaging, he gave me permission to ask Alyssa in September even though he would still be deployed. When making plans how I would propose, I knew that this would be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wanted to make it something special. I came across a video on YouTube that sparked my idea with what I could do for Alyssa, and immediately I set my mind at work, and over a family vacation flight to the West, I came up with the idea to write a song to a tune which was special to Alyssa. It was quite a time of suspense and shaking on my part as I watched Alyssa from the cafe security cameras and then came down to surprise her with a ring. It will be an unforgettable time in our life.
From there, our love has grown even deeper, and the Lord has drawn us even closer. We are so thankful to our parents for their clear guidance, not only during this time in our lives, but before, as we were growing up and preparing for our future.
We also want to thank our pastors who played such a key role in directing us the right way and preaching the word faithfully.
Most of all, we want to give praise and glory to the Lord for the incredible way that He has worked every detail of our meeting and our relationship since then.
He has shown Himself evident in our lives so many ways over the past year, and we know that He'll continue to do so if we keep our focus on Him.
Alyssa and I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about how God has worked in our lives. We are extremely grateful to the Lord for everything that He's done for us, and how He'll continue to work in us and through us as we start our life together, serving Him.
And thank you for coming to celebrate this special day with us. We feel so blessed to be surrounded by loving family and friends who have shown such great support at this time in our lives.
It means so much to us to have all of you here. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the day.